Do you live alone in the woods and have the feeling that unseen creatures are watching you every night? 75% of people living in remote areas have no idea that the slight sound outside the door could be anything other than an animal. In the fall of 1987, during a violent mountain storm in Flathead National Forest, a widowed woman heard a cry outside her cabin. Not an animal, not the wind, but something else. That night, she didn't just rescue a creature. She became a mother to a being from another world. A young Bigfoot orphan left behind in the storm. She named him Dusk. And what followed was a story of love, fear, loyalty, and the kind of family that's not built by blood, but by choice. This is not a myth. This is not a fairy tale. This is a truth the forest has been keeping quiet for decades. Now, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from? And may I ask your name, dear viewer? Let's see how far this story can travel, from this little cabin in Montana all the way to your home and beyond. From my heart to yours, thank you for being here. If this story touches something in you, gently tap like and consider subscribing. Together, let's build a warm, respectful community of those who believe there's still mystery, wonder, and maybe, just maybe, a Bigfoot out there, waiting to be seen. The wind scraped through the pines like something searching. It was the kind of wind that had memory. It didn't howl. It whispered, dragged its fingers along the tin roof of the cabin until the whole thing trembled. And inside, the flickering lantern light threw long shadows over carved wood and weathered hands. Margaret Hale sat at the table in the center of the cabin, her shoulders hunched in the glow, carving slowly into a block of pine. She wore her husband's old flannel, sleeves rolled up just enough to reveal the veins under her papery skin, and every so often, she'd pause and glance toward the radio on the counter. The local weatherman spoke with a voice that didn't fight the storm, just rode along with it. High winds through the night. Gusts may reach 50. Stay in if you can. Keep the dogs close. She didn't need the reminder. Birch was already curled on a quilt near the fire, her old bones shifting with discomfort. Her breathing had changed in the last hour, deeper, strained. Margaret could hear it now, that low whine in her throat. Her girl was in pain. She set the carving down gently, a near-finished figure of a shepherd dog, and stood, the wooden chair creaking beneath her as she moved. Birch tried to rise when she came near, but her back legs buckled and she slumped back down with a groan. No, honey, Margaret murmured, dropping to her knees, stroking the dog's gray muzzle with the reverence of someone holding something holy. You just stay still. I'm right here. The storm outside cracked loud enough to rattle the window panes, and somewhere deeper in the trees, something echoed like a falling branch. Or maybe something else entirely. Birch let out a sharp, panicked yelp. Her body began to seize in spasms. Margaret, with more calm than she felt, pulled the blankets closer, knelt beside her, and placed both hands on the dog's sides. That's it. Come on, baby. I've got you. The last time she'd seen an animal give birth was nearly 20 years ago. Her husband, Everett, had helped a neighbor's cow who was stuck breech. She remembered the way he'd whispered to the creature, his large hands somehow gentle in the thick of the mess. Margaret had stood back then, arms folded, watching him in awe. She hadn't thought about that in a long time, but now the memory hit her like a stone thrown through a window. She swallowed it down. Birch's cries grew sharper, and then, suddenly, quieter. A small, slick body slid into Margaret's trembling hands. The thing was so still at first, so pale and fragile, that her heart dropped. Come on, she whispered, clearing its nose, rubbing its back. The tiniest whimper came out. A second later, the pup wriggled weakly and began to root toward its mother. Margaret laughed, breathless, more out of relief than anything. "There you are," she said softly, brushing a tear from her cheek. "Hello, little light." The pup's fur was the color of snow under moonlight. Dawn, she thought. "You're not alone anymore, Birch," she said. "And neither am I." She wrapped the tiny body close to Birch's belly and watched as the old dog curled around it with a trembling sigh. It should have ended there, with warmth and the steady rhythm of newborn breath. But 2 hours later, the wind shifted, and something else cried out. It wasn't the storm. It cut through it, higher-pitched, thinner, like a baby. But not quite. Margaret froze, hand hovering near the lantern. The sound faded. Silence returned, save for the rain and the creak of trees. But then it came again, louder, longer, closer. She stood, her body protesting every movement, pulled on her raincoat, grabbed the lantern, and stepped out into the screaming dark. The rain hit sideways, cold, unforgiving. The light from her lantern cast a trembling halo as she moved down the path beyond the cabin, boots slipping on pine needles. The forest here knew her. It had known her for decades, but tonight, something felt different, like the woods were holding their breath. 100 feet out, she saw it. A tree, large enough to crush a car, had cracked in the wind and fallen across the old trail. Beneath it lay something massive, covered in fur matted with rain and mud. Not bear, not elk, bigger. The body was pinned at the chest. Its breath came in labored wheezes, chest rising once, twice, then stalling. And beside it, trying to crawl, was a smaller shape. The same fur, but darker, almost black with water. It let out another cry, weaker this time. Margaret's heart nearly stopped. She stepped closer, raising the lantern. The creature, mother or father, she couldn't tell, turned its head slowly toward her. One eye had clouded over, the other still faintly golden, locked with hers. Then it moved. Not with force, not with fear. Just one slow, deliberate gesture. A hand, enormous and trembling, lifted from the ground, reached toward her, and touched her boot. Then, with the last of its strength, it nudged the small creature forward. There was no snarl, no growl, no resistance, just surrender. Then it stilled, for good. Margaret couldn't move at first, couldn't breathe. She stood in the storm, surrounded by trees and shadows and the impossible. And then she bent down. She wrapped the tiny, shivering thing in her coat, held it to her chest, and turned back toward the cabin. It didn't fight. Just whimpered once, then went still against her ribs. By the time she reached the porch, the lantern was nearly out. She kicked the door gently with her boot, stumbled inside, dripping. Birch lifted her head, ears twitching. Margaret knelt down beside her, laid the bundle next to the pup. Birch growled low, just a warning, but then sniffed. Sniffed again, and then, slowly, gently, she licked the damp forehead of the creature Margaret had found. Margaret didn't breathe. She just watched as Birch shifted, curling again, this time slightly differently. The pup had been nestled close, but now the old dog moved, repositioned herself so that the new one, this other one, was closer to her belly. As if she understood, Margaret didn't say anything, just reached out, touched the dark, matted fur. The creature didn't flinch. It only pressed closer to the warmth. The storm went on, but inside the cabin, 3 generations of breath moved in sync. By morning, the storm had passed. A thick fog rolled off the ridgeline, blanketing everything in white. Margaret stepped outside, her boots crunching the damp earth. The world was still, except for the occasional drip from the eaves. Then she saw them. Tracks, circling the cabin, deep, deliberate, huge. Not from the one she'd buried under the tree. These were many, bare, wide-footed impressions in the mud. Some stopped just short of the porch. None tried to enter. Just a circle, as if something had stood guard. She followed the prints for a moment before a crunch of gravel made her turn. Rayburn Cole, in his Green Ranger coat, was walking up the path, scanning the ground like he always did after a storm. He raised a hand. "Just checking on the old place." Margaret nodded. "Lost a tree out back." He moved closer, paused near the tracks. His face tightened. "These weren't here last week." "No." He crouched, ran his fingers along the edges. "Not bear, not elk, something else entirely." Margaret didn't answer. He looked at her. Not suspicion, not fear, just a quiet question. "But it didn't try to come inside," he said finally. "Just watched. Maybe even guarded." She didn't nod, didn't deny, just let the silence hang there between them. That night, with the fire low and the lantern turned down, she sat again at her table. Birch slept on the rug, her body curled around two small shapes, one pale, one dark. Both pressed tight against her ribs. Margaret didn't sleep much, just sat and watched. The fog outside thickened, pressing up against the windows like breath on glass. And then she saw it. Just before dawn, the dark one stirred. A small clawed hand curled into a loose fist. The other pup, Dawn, shifted closer, tucked its muzzle under the arm, and exhaled. Light and shadow, breathing together. Two creatures born of storm and silence, finding rhythm in each other's warmth. Margaret looked on, her heart caught in her throat. Outside, somewhere in the trees, something moved. Not loudly, not in fear, just a presence, tall, watching. And then it was gone. The trees closed again, and the world exhaled. The air that morning hung like a held breath. Cold, but not biting, still but not quiet. From the eaves of the cabin, icicles dripped in steady rhythm, and the fire inside crackled low, more glow than flame. Margaret sat with her hands wrapped around a ceramic mug, still warm from the stove. Her fingers ached, not from the cold, but from something older than weather. On the floor, Birch lay curled like a crescent moon, her ribs rising and falling in that familiar rhythm that had once soothed Margaret through worse storms. Nestled into her side were the two small bodies, one a pale fuzz of soft white, the other darker, almost earthy brown, barely stirring. Dawn suckled without pause, small paws kneading instinctively against her mother's belly. But the other, the one who came from rain and shadow, hadn't moved. Margaret leaned forward, her mug forgotten. She set it down carefully, then reached with quiet hands. Her finger hovered over the smaller creature's nose, pausing for a moment. No sound. She inched closer. There, just the faintest trace of breath against her skin. It was weak. Too weak. She pressed the back of her hand gently to its chest. The rise and fall were shallow, like it hadn't decided if it wanted to stay. "No," she whispered. "Not after everything." She tried to shift him gently toward Birch, guiding his tiny mouth toward the warmth and milk. But he turned his face away, eyes still shut, letting out a thin, pained whimper that didn't sound like it came from a pup or a child. It sounded like it came from something lost. She tried again. He refused again. Dawn, sensing movement, shifted closer and pushed against him, her tail flicking as she fed with growing strength. Margaret moved to pull her back slightly, to give the other room. He didn't take it. She closed her eyes, an ache rising through her ribs. A memory she hadn't let surface in years came rushing in. Her sister's baby, born too early one winter in Missoula. The hospital lights, the way everyone's voices dropped into whispers, the way the silence in the room afterward felt wrong. That helpless, pitiful stillness she hated most of all. And now, this small body in front of her was bringing it all back. Dawn paused in her feeding, head tilting slightly as she looked toward the still figure beside her. She let out a low, puppy-sized yip, then another. Not loud, almost coaxing. She nudged him. Nothing. Then, she did something Margaret didn't expect, didn't think a dog could even do. She shuffled closer to him, dipped her head, and gently pushed against his shoulder. A nudge, a call, and then she turned back to Birch, nuzzled into her mother's belly, and fed with a pointed urgency, like she was showing him how. Margaret didn't move. She barely breathed. The Dark One stirred. His fingers, stubby but longer than Dawn's paws, curled slightly. His head turned toward the sound. His nose twitched once. Then he reached forward and latched on. It wasn't strong. It wasn't confident. But it was something. Margaret watched the muscles in his throat work. She heard it. That soft, steady rhythm. A gulp, then another. He drank. And just like that, he chose to live. Margaret blinked hard, then wiped her eyes with the back of her sleeve. "Well, look at that," she whispered. "You're not going to leave her behind after all." The fire popped. The day drifted forward. In the following days, she marked time not with clocks, but with small milestones. The way Dawn started to crawl with more certainty. The way the Darker One learned to press his fingers against the wood floor for balance. Neither had opened their eyes yet, but they breathed now in harmony. She began calling the Darker One Dusk, without saying it aloud. It just felt right. Dawn and dusk. Light and shadow. Neither whole without the other. One morning, when the frost on the windows thinned and sunlight spilled across the cabin floor in long golden streaks, Margaret sat at the table, sharpening her chisel. The sound was soft, regular. Below her, Dawn stirred first. Her tail twitched, ears perked, and then her eyes blinked open for the first time. They were a soft brown, the color of wet cedar. She looked around, confused but calm, blinking at the light. Moments later, Dusk opened his eyes too. His gaze didn't lift to Margaret. It went sideways, toward the pup lying beside him. The two locked eyes. There was no flinch, no cry, just stillness. And something unspoken passed between them, something older than language. Dawn yipped once. Dusk didn't reply in sound, but he moved. He reached out a hand, touched her shoulder, and then pulled back. That same day, Margaret gave them a block of spare pine, about the length of her hand, to roll between them. She'd thought it might help with teething. Dawn bit it immediately, chewing as pups do. Dusk took longer. He ran his fingers along it, tapped once. Then again and again. Margaret froze. It wasn't random. He tapped once, paused, tapped 3 times, then paused again, then repeated. It wasn't a game. It was a rhythm, something intentional. She stopped what she was doing and leaned in. Dusk looked up briefly, then continued. Tap. Pause. Tap, tap, tap. Dawn scooted forward and stepped on the block, as if trying to keep it still. Then she barked, a tiny, excited sound. He tapped again, ignoring her. Margaret's throat went dry. This wasn't instinct. This was memory, muscle memory, learned somewhere else. He was speaking, not with words, but with rhythm. She leaned back in her chair, heart pounding, not with fear, but with awe. That night, after the fire burned low, she stepped outside to catch a breath of air. The trees still stood silent. The fog hung low, but something was different. She turned her head toward the edge of the forest, and there it was, on a mossy rock near the tree line. Just before the woods swallowed all light, someone had left something. Not an animal, not a human, but someone. A small arrangement sat neatly there. Berries, deep red and purple, placed in a careful spiral. Pine needles, fresh and green, tucked in a curve. And in the center, a ring of smooth stones surrounding a handful of leaves that hadn't yet browned. She didn't touch it. She just stood there, hands at her sides, and whispered a thank you to the trees. Inside, the cabin felt warmer, safer. Later, when Rayburn stopped by with a basket of dry goods and a half-excuse about checking wind damage, his eyes swept the room. He didn't say much. He never did. But when he saw the small figures curled on the rug, and Birch sleeping with one eye half open, something in him shifted. After a long silence, he finally spoke. "When I was a boy," he said, voice low, "I saw something. Near the creek, just before dusk. It wasn't a bear. It stood upright. Tall. Its eyes didn't just look. They saw." He let the words hang, like smoke curling from an extinguished flame. "No one believed me," he added. Margaret didn't respond right away. She just handed him a cup of coffee and said, "Some things aren't meant to be proven, just protected." He nodded, and that was enough. That night the fire danced again. Dawn and Dusk lay curled, side by side. Birch rested a paw across them, her breath slow and even. Margaret sat in her chair, watching the embers shift and glow. Beyond the window, between the trees, dark shapes moved. Not quickly, not threatening. They moved like guardians. Silent, intentional, watching. They didn't come closer, but they didn't leave either. They were listening. And from the cabin came the softest sound, the faintest tapping of small fingers against pine. A language being remembered, a name being spoken. The first snow came quietly, without thunder or warning. By morning, the trees stood heavier, their limbs drooping under a clean white weight. The path to the woods disappeared entirely, buried beneath a sheet of pale silence, and the smoke from the cabin chimney drifted up into a sky the color of worn denim. Inside, the heat from the stove pressed against the window glass, fogging the edges where Margaret stood holding a steaming bowl of oats, watching the forest vanish. Her breath made a soft cloud in the chill room. Despite the fire, the corners of the cabin held onto cold like old secrets. Behind her, Birch shifted with a groan, curling protectively around the two growing shapes that now filled more of the rug than they used to. Dawn had become bold. She pushed ahead wherever she went, from the blanket near the stove to the edge of the porch, tail wagging like a flag. Her eyes were bright, her ears always twitching toward some invisible sound. Dusk, quieter, watched before he moved. He touched things more than she did, listened longer. He tilted his head when the wind whistled, as if it was saying something he almost understood. Margaret watched them from the table, hands wrapped around her mug. There was no denying it now. Dusk had grown faster than any ordinary animal. His limbs were longer than they should be for a pup, his hands too articulate, his eyes too knowing. But still, he stayed near Dawn. Like her gravity kept him grounded. They chased each other in short spurts across the wood floor, slid into chairs, tumbled into quilts, fought playfully with grunts and yips. Birch tolerated it, groaning but never growling. She was slower now. Her hips stiffened in the cold. Sometimes she didn't rise when called. Margaret watched her too. Then came the morning that changed everything. Margaret had carved a small wooden fish from pine. A simple shape, smooth edges, a piece of string tied to its tail so she could hang it near the stove as a wind chime. It smelled like clean sawdust and oil. She left it on the floor by accident while gathering more kindling. Dawn spotted it first. She dashed over, snatched it in her teeth, and bolted toward the corner with a playful growl. Dusk's eyes tracked her. He rose, loped after her, and tried to grab the string. They pulled at it together, slipping on the worn rug. It should have been harmless. It should have ended in laughter. But Dawn lost her footing on the edge of the threshold near the door. She tumbled down the short slope outside, landing with a yelp on the packed snow. Her body twisted midair, and when she hit the ground, her leg didn't land right. Margaret heard the cry through the door. She ran outside, apron flapping. Dusk stood frozen halfway down the porch steps, staring at Dawn, who lay in the snow, whimpering. One back leg bent awkwardly. Margaret dropped to her knees, arms outstretched. "Sweet girl, come here, come on. Oh, Dawn." Her hands hovered over the injured limb. Dawn licked her hand once, but didn't move. Behind her, Dusk took one step forward. His face was tight. His breath came fast. Margaret turned, and for a brief second, saw something in his eyes that scared her. Recognition. Shame. Dawn's gaze shifted to him, her teeth bared in a small, involuntary growl. Not angry, but panicked. Afraid. Dusk flinched like he'd been struck, and then he ran, straight past Margaret, past the cabin, into the tree line. She shouted after him once, twice. Nothing. The trees swallowed him. She had no choice. She scooped Dawn gently into her coat and hurried back inside, her boots slipping on the frozen ground. The pup whimpered as Margaret laid her on the blanket near the fire. She fetched clean cloth, warm water. The first aid kit she kept for Birch. Her hands moved from instinct, muscle memory from another life. All the while, the door remained cracked. The wind hissed through it. By nightfall, Dusk hadn't returned. Margaret sat with her back to the stove, holding Dawn against her chest, listening to the quiet of the cabin. Outside, the snow deepened. The air grew heavier. When she dozed, it was only for moments. Her ears still turned toward the door. Just past midnight, she woke to the softest sound. A tapping. Not frantic, not loud, just deliberate. On the side of the cabin wall. Then another tap, then another. The rhythm was slow, steady, familiar, like the one Dusk had tapped on the block of wood weeks ago. It wrapped around the house like a lullaby, like a reassurance. No steps, no voices, just the gossamer beat of something trying to say, "You're not alone." Margaret didn't open the door. She didn't need to. The next morning, snow clung to every branch and roof tile like lace. Margaret stepped outside slowly, arms wrapped around herself, her boots sinking into fresh powder. The light was blue-gray, the sun low but trying. She followed her instincts more than her eyes. To the left of the cabin, near the old woodpile, she saw them. Tracks, not from Dusk. These were bigger, wider, spaced differently. A circle of them around the small wooden shelter Birch had once used. The prints didn't cross each other. They were clean, as if someone had stood watch through the night. Her breath hitched. When she came back inside, she found Dawn half awake, ears twitching, head lifting weakly. She licked Margaret's hand, her body trembling but no longer in pain. The worst had passed. But Dusk hadn't come home. She waited 2 more hours before stepping into her coat again. The sky was thickening. Snow would return by dusk. If he stayed out there alone, in guilt, he wouldn't survive. She called Rayburn. He arrived with his old Jeep and a deep line between his eyebrows. She didn't have to explain much. He understood too quickly. The two of them tracked the direction Dusk had run. Prints faint, disrupted by wind, but still visible under the trees where the snow had settled lightly. They followed them beyond the ridge, past the frozen creek, into a part of the woods Margaret hadn't entered since Everett died. The silence deepened there. Even the birds held back. Then they found something. A curl of dark fur caught on a branch, a shallow scrape in the snow, and further ahead, a set of prints that weren't from Dusk. Bigger, watching. She didn't say it aloud, but Rayburn saw it too. His jaw clenched. He said nothing, just kept walking. At the base of a massive fir, near a half-frozen pond, they saw them. Dawn was lying at the root of the tree, body curled tight, her breath visible in the cold. And wrapped around her, shielding her from snow and wind, was Dusk. His arms were curved like a cradle, his head bent low over hers, his eyes half closed but still alert. His hands moved now and then, brushing gently over her injured leg. Not to wake her, not to touch, to soothe. There were marks carved into the bark of the fir, shallow indentations spaced evenly. A rhythm again, a message. Margaret couldn't read it, not fully, but she understood. She stepped forward quietly. Dusk raised his head slowly. His eyes found hers, and in them, No fear, no panic, just a question. Was he still loved? She walked to him, knelt without a word, and placed her hand on her chest. "You don't have to run from family," she whispered. "Not forever." Dusk's body relaxed, just barely. His fingers uncurled. He looked down at Dawn, then back at Margaret. She reached for his hand. He didn't pull away. Rayburn stood a few feet behind, watching it all. His face unreadable. But in his eyes, acceptance. Together they carried Dawn home. Dusk didn't let go of her once. That night, with the fire high and the storm returning, the three of them, Birch, Dawn, Dusk, lay curled like roots of the same tree. Margaret sat nearby, holding her husband's old chisel, the handle worn smooth with time. She didn't carve that night. She just listened. Outside the window, the snow fell in slow spirals. The trees swayed with their own rhythm, and beyond the edge of sight, somewhere in the forest, something watched. Not waiting, guarding. As Dusk dreamed, his fingers moved against the rug, tapping, slow, steady, like a name being whispered back and forth across the dark. The cabin, at last, felt whole, but the woods had only just begun to speak. The snow didn't melt so much as it slipped away, day by day, like memories softening into something quieter. What was once a thick blanket over the hills became patches, then puddles, then the damp smell of thawed pine needles and wet soil rising in the morning air. It was spring in Whispering Pines, but not the kind that bloomed in bright colors. Here, spring crept back in through fog and mud, through swollen creeks and the sound of dripping from every tree branch. Margaret sat on the front porch with a piece of soft pine in her lap, whittling the last curve of a tiny wooden bear. The porch door creaked behind her every few minutes as Dawn ran in and out, never walking if she could run, kicking up tufts of moss and wet dirt in her wake. Her energy had returned fully, her injured leg healed with only the faintest stiffness. Dusk followed more slowly. He'd grown taller through the winter, his back now nearly reaching Margaret's waist. His gait was careful, his body more solid. But there was still something soft in him, something that paused before every movement like he was asking permission from the world before stepping forward. That morning she had knocked the carving table to shake off the sawdust and bark shavings, and Dusk, standing nearby, had mirrored the rhythm exactly. 3 taps, a pause, 2 more. Then he looked at her, waiting. She smiled, gave the table 1 more knock, and he answered. It wasn't a game. It was conversation. They were finding a rhythm that belonged only to them. But inside the cabin, there were new rhythms being tested. Dawn had started claiming corners, pushing her way into the best spots near the fire, dragging toys beneath chairs, giving a quick bark when Dusk came too close to the bowl she was eating from. She was younger, but faster, hungrier, more territorial. Margaret watched it unfold without alarm, but with growing attention. Dusk didn't retaliate. He always gave her the spot, always stepped aside. But one evening, after Dawn had shoved him away from the fire for the 3rd time, he made a low, frustrated grunt. Not loud, not threatening, just tired. That was when Margaret began teaching them boundaries. Not with harshness, not with scolding, with symbols. She raised a hand when things needed to stop. No yelling, just the flat of her palm. Dusk responded instantly, freezing when he saw it. Dawn learned slower, barking once before quieting down. When tension built, Margaret gave a low whistle, the kind Everett used to call Birch in from the fields. It calmed the air. And when either of them started pushing too far, she'd place her hand to her own chest and say, "This is home. We don't hurt in this home." They didn't understand the words, but they understood the tone, the gesture. Over time, Dusk began placing his own hand to his chest when Dawn stole something from him, like he was echoing the promise back to her. Margaret didn't know what to call that gesture, but it felt sacred. Then came the story at the store. A couple from out of town had been hiking along the ridge trail behind Margaret's property and took a wrong turn. They found themselves on a deer path that ran near the edge of the clearing just before dusk. From a distance, they claimed they saw a child, or something shaped like a child, covered in dark fur, playing with a white dog near the edge of the trees. They didn't approach. They left quickly, spooked, but not before telling the tale at the Whispering Pines General Store the next morning over coffee and gas station donuts. By noon, the whispers had started. By evening, someone had already said the word wolf child. Someone else said Margaret had lost her mind and taken in a feral animal. By nightfall, someone claimed she'd been hiding something for years, something that wasn't quite human. When Rayburn came by that evening, he didn't knock. He just stood on the porch, his hand resting on the railing like he was trying to feel the pulse of the place. Margaret opened the door before he could call out. "You've got people asking questions," he said, voice low, eyes scanning the edge of the trees. "Not hunters yet, but curiosity's got a way of spreading." "I figured," she said. "He's been careful, but accidents happen." Rayburn's jaw tensed. "It's not about you being careful, Margaret. It's about someone else not being, about someone seeing something they shouldn't and thinking it's theirs to deal with." Her fingers curled around the edge of the door. "He's not a danger." "I believe you," Rayburn said. "But that doesn't mean they will." He left a sack of dried beans and flour by the door, nodded once, and disappeared into the fog. Inside, the cabin felt smaller than usual. That night, Margaret sat at her workbench with Dusk beside her. She carved slow, gentle strokes into a fresh block of cedar. He watched closely, his hands mimicking the movements in the air, not touching, just learning the pattern. Then he tapped. 2 soft beats, a pause, a third. She smiled, turned the block toward him, and let him tap on it too. Dawn patted over, curious, and plopped her paw on the piece, wagging her tail. Then she yelped, annoyed that it didn't move like a toy, and barked once, trying to chew the corner. Dusk pulled it back protectively, not angry, more confused. Margaret placed a hand on his shoulder. "She's just learning differently," she said, knowing he wouldn't understand the words, but needing to say them anyway. He didn't resist when Dawn tried to paw at him again. He just held the block steady, and for a moment, she stopped, nose twitching. Then, with a sound that almost resembled a laugh, she tapped it too. They took turns, slowly, unevenly, but together. That was the same night Margaret saw the shadow. The lanterns were turned down to save oil, and the fireplace cast wide arcs of gold across the wood walls. She moved to the window to draw the curtains, and froze. Something stood just beyond the porch, past the edge of the light. It was tall, taller than a man, shoulders broad, posture not hunched like an animal, but upright, steady. She couldn't see the face, only the glint of reflected light where eyes should be. He didn't move. She didn't either. The air between them felt thick, like water just before a wave crests. Then, slowly, the shape turned and vanished into the trees. She didn't speak for a long time, but inside her, something shifted, not in fear, in understanding. She told no one, not even Rayburn. The next morning, she stood on the porch, mug in hand, watching Dawn and Dusk circle each other in the wet grass. Dawn barked once. Dusk reached out, touched her shoulder, and they both dropped into a crouch, playing, wrestling gently. Margaret's heart squeezed with something like joy and grief all tangled together. She spoke softly, barely louder than a whisper, to the trees. "If you're out there," she said, eyes scanning the forest, "I'm doing the best I can." The wind moved the pines in reply, a creak, a sway. No other sound. Later that evening, as the sun slipped low and cast long shadows across the floorboards, Dusk and Dawn curled up beside the fire. Birch lay nearby, her breathing slower these days, her eyes cloudy but kind. Margaret sat beside them, her carving tools untouched, hands resting in her lap. She glanced down, Dusk had placed his large hand over Dawn's back in her sleep. His fingers, long and rough, curled slightly around her side. Not possessive, not heavy. Just present. Dawn stirred once, nestled closer. Outside, the trees darkened, and the first stars of spring flickered between their limbs. And far off, deeper in the woods, something watched. Not hunting, not hiding, just waiting. The boundary between worlds had not disappeared, but something new had taken root where the line had once been. Not erasure, coexistence. The light that afternoon was wrong. Not stormy yet, not dramatic, but too still, too flat. The kind of sky that seemed to press down instead of open up. The kind that made birds quiet and wind hesitant. Margaret noticed it when she stepped onto the porch with a bucket of scraps, eyes tracing the pale ridgeline above the trees. Even the pine needles seemed unsure, hanging motionless in mid-breath. Birch didn't follow her outside like usual. She stayed curled on the rug near the stove, head on her paws, eyes half-lidded with the fatigue that had settled into her bones more deeply than the cold ever had. The air smelled like wet bark and something waiting. Dawn was chasing squirrels. Not to catch them, just to feel the rush, to dart and pivot and hear her own paws thump across the moss and pine needles. She was faster now, lean and long-legged. The memory of her injury was nearly gone, at least to her. Dusk trailed behind, always close, always watching. But today something was off. He moved with more tension. He'd grown tall in the last weeks, chest broadening, arms stronger. His movements weren't clumsy anymore. They were heavy, solid. Margaret had seen it in the way the porch boards creaked beneath him, in the way Dawn flinched a little when he moved too fast. She'd tried to guide it, set boundaries, remind him of softness, but nature grows in its own direction, no matter how carefully you try to prune it. Dawn darted up the rise behind the cabin, a slope slick with early spring melt, moss still clinging to cold rock. A squirrel vanished into the brush, and she gave chase, barking once, just for the thrill of it. Dusk followed, not out of excitement, out of instinct. Margaret was inside when it happened, pouring hot water over dried herbs, the smell of mint and lemon balm rising like memory. She heard the bark turn to a yelp, heard the thud, the silence. She dropped the kettle. Outside, the slope fell steeply just beyond the tree line, a shallow ravine dotted with boulders and dry roots. Dawn lay at the bottom, twisted awkwardly against a fallen log. Her leg jutted out in the wrong direction. Not like last time. Worse. Dusk stood frozen at the top of the rise. His hands were raised, as if still reaching, his face a perfect mirror of something shattered. Margaret ran. She reached Dawn first, her heart already racing ahead of her body. The pup whimpered but didn't move. Her eyes were wide, white showing. Margaret touched her gently, whispering words she wasn't even aware of, checking for blood, for breath, for something to bargain with. Then she looked up. Dusk hadn't moved. His feet were rooted. His arms hung at his sides now. He looked down at her like a child realizing for the first time what harm looks like when it comes from your own hands. Margaret's voice was steady. "Go back to the house." Dusk blinked. Once. His chest heaved. Then he turned and ran, not toward the cabin but into the woods. Dawn's breathing was sharp, broken in rhythm. Margaret didn't have time to chase both of them. She bundled the pup into her coat and moved as fast as her knees would allow. Down the slope, across the clearing, back to the warmth and light. She didn't look toward the trees. Inside, she wrapped Dawn in blankets, gave her the good pain drops, soaked rags in warm broth. The hours blurred. The rain started softly, tapping like hesitant fingers across the tin roof. Birch whined once, pushing her nose against Dawn's side, then curled herself tighter. Night fell hard and early. Wind coiled through the branches. Margaret sat by the stove with her head in her hands. Dusk hadn't come back. Not even a rustle. Not even a shadow near the tree line. She couldn't help but hear the sound of Dawn's growl again, the flash of her eyes when she looked at him. A look not of anger, of fear. She hadn't meant it. Margaret knew that, but Dusk had seen it, and it had buried itself somewhere deep. When she woke, it was only because the door creaked. The cabin was cold. The fire had burned low. Birch was sleeping, but Dawn wasn't on the blanket. The door was ajar. Rain pooled on the floor just inside. A faint trail of red marked where a paw had slipped. Margaret's heart stopped. She grabbed her coat and flashlight, bolted outside, not even stopping for boots. Rain poured hard now, turning the world into streaks and sound. The flashlight beam cut through fog and trees like a blade, but the light was swallowed almost immediately. Rayburn arrived minutes later, the old Jeep rumbling up the trail with its headlights bouncing off wet bark. She didn't ask how he knew. He didn't ask what had happened. He just nodded and said, "Let's go." They followed the trail, mud, paw prints, drag marks. Mixed with them were larger tracks. Familiar, dusk, and something else, fainter, older. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The trees closed in tighter as they moved deeper. The rain softened, then stopped altogether, as if the forest had decided they were close enough. Then they saw it. At the base of an old fir, so wide it would take 3 grown men to circle it, was a small hollow, protected by overhanging roots and thick moss. Inside, barely lit by the flashlight's trembling glow, were 2 shapes. Dawn, soaked and shivering, curled tight, and Dusk wrapped around her like a shelter. He looked up as they approached, his face streaked with rain and mud, his eyes swollen, but calm. He was humming, not with words, with rhythm. A low guttural tone that rose and fell like breath, like a lullaby only his kind would know. His hand rested on Dawn's injured leg, not pressing, just present. On the bark behind him, someone had carved markings, deep, spaced evenly. Margaret stepped closer and ran her fingers over them, the same rhythm he used on the cabin walls when he was afraid, when he was asking if he was still welcome. She knelt slowly, ignoring the pain in her knees. "I'm not mad," she said softly. "I know you didn't mean to hurt her." He didn't blink. "You didn't know how strong you were. Now you do." Still no movement. She reached out and placed her hand over his, right where it rested on Dawn. Family doesn't leave each other in the dark, even when it's hard. Dusk let out a breath. Not a sigh, a release, like something had loosened inside him. He helped lift Dawn gently, cradling her with a tenderness that would have silenced any doubts. Rayburn took the lead back through the trees. He didn't ask questions, but his flashlight lingered once on the symbols carved into the bark. His mouth tightened, and he looked toward the forest with something close to reverence, or maybe warning. Back at the cabin, the rain returned. The fire roared again. Birch pressed close to Dawn. Margaret rubbed Dusk's back with long, slow strokes. She didn't say anything more. That night, none of them slept easily, but the house felt full. Later, when Margaret stepped outside for air, the forest was still. Moonlight glinted off the wet leaves, and deep within the trees, a faint light shimmered between 2 trunks, then vanished. She didn't follow it. She just stood there and listened. Somewhere very far off, a single wooden knock echoed. Then another. Not fear, not a threat, just a breath, and the promise that someone else was still listening. The tone will remain deeply human, cinematic, and American in cultural reference. Crafted not for reading, but for being listened to like a story told by someone who once lived it. You will receive the complete storytelling scene in one seamless voice, starting now. The morning started quiet, but not in the way winter is quiet. This was a stillness that hummed beneath the surface, like something waiting to bloom or speak. The frost hadn't left the edges of the meadow yet, but the sun had started to stretch longer fingers over the hills. Margaret stood barefoot just outside the cabin, her breath visible, a mug in her hand cooling too fast to matter. Dusk was standing at the edge of the woods, silent, tall, his silhouette backlit by the gentle veil of mist hanging just above the ground. He didn't look back. He lifted his arm, palm open, not beckoning, not demanding, inviting. Margaret knew. She didn't ask where. She didn't ask why. The rhythm had changed. The house, the woods, the way the birds had gone quiet just seconds before. It all told her something was different now. She called softly over her shoulder. Dawn limped out, healed but with a slight hitch in her gait. The kind of mark that time doesn't erase but teaches you to walk with. Birch stayed behind. She didn't rise. Her breathing was slow and steady. Margaret watched her for one long beat, then nodded. She didn't take a pack. She didn't lock the door. Some doors aren't meant to be locked when trust has taken root. Dusk moved first, his feet silent on the moss. Margaret followed, Dawn at her heel, the air slowly shifting from cabin scent to forest breath. They walked past the old creek bed, where water had started to return in rivulets beneath the melting snow. They crossed a stone field where deer sometimes gathered. Upward, always upward. The woods thickened. The path disappeared. Dusk never hesitated. The trees grew older here, taller, heavier. The bark darker, the silence deeper. Margaret had never walked this far into the ridge behind her land. She'd always assumed the forest wrapped itself in its own secrets, things not meant for her. But today, she was being invited inside. When they reached the ridge, the light changed. They stepped into a hollow hidden by rock and bramble, a dip in the landscape that gathered morning fog and filtered sunlight like it belonged to something sacred. The air was still. No birds, no insects. Just space. Just waiting. She didn't see them at first, but then shapes began to step forward from behind trees, from behind the moss-covered stone walls of the hollow. One by one, they were tall, taller than Dusk, covered in fur that matched the land, brown, rust, dark silver, shoulders broad, chests wide, eyes deep set beneath heavy brows. They didn't bare teeth. They didn't raise arms. They watched. Margaret felt something rise in her chest. Not fear, not awe. Something like memory. Something like recognition. Dusk stood still in the center of the hollow. He looked at her once, then stepped forward into the ring that had formed around them. Then the elder appeared. He was slower, older, his fur streaked with pale gray that caught the light like thread. His back was slightly bent, but not in weakness, in weight. The weight of knowing. He crossed the circle slowly, eyes never leaving Margaret. She didn't move, but she swallowed hard. He stopped in front of her, his hand, enormous, calloused, trembling just enough to betray age, rose and pressed lightly against her shoulder. It wasn't a threat, it wasn't a test, it was acknowledgement. She exhaled for the first time in minutes. Dusk turned toward the clan then, stepping further into the circle. They began to approach, one by one. Not fast, not loud. Each of them touched his arm, or his shoulder, or bowed slightly. Not with words, with presence. Margaret noticed the rhythm, the way their movements folded into one another. Like a language made of gesture. She felt Dawn press against her leg. Then came the sound. The trees, or maybe the rocks, or maybe something carried in the bones of the place, began to vibrate softly. It was wood and stone and hollow earth. A rhythm. Slow, deep, repeating. Margaret realized they weren't just standing. They were performing something old. Some struck sticks on logs, others clapped hand to hand. A few tapped stones together, but it wasn't chaotic. It was orchestral, grounded. The rhythm matched Dusk's breathing, then shifted, then rose. He stood in the center as the sound swirled, and then he made a sound of his own. Not a cry, not a bark. A low vibration that traveled outward from his chest. The others responded. The rhythm surged. Then one of them, a young one, no taller than Margaret's chest, stepped out of the circle. It held something small in its hands, a cluster of wild berries, wrapped in long blades of grass, tied with vines. It walked slowly toward Dawn. Margaret tensed, but Dawn did not flinch. The young Bigfoot bent low and extended the offering. Dawn sniffed once, then again, and without hesitation, gently took the gift. The circle pulsed once, collectively, like a breath held and released. They had accepted her, not tolerated. Accepted. Margaret didn't cry, but her eyes burned. She felt movement behind her. Rayburn. She hadn't heard him arrive. He stood just beyond the outer ring, half hidden behind a cedar, his ranger jacket soaked through with mist, his face pale. But he didn't step forward. He didn't raise his camera. He didn't speak. She turned slightly toward him, and he held her gaze. And then he stepped back, vanished into the trees. Some things don't belong in files or reports. Some things are meant to be left where they were found. Later, as the rhythm faded, the clan began to drift apart, not in retreat, but like fog rolling back uphill. Dusk remained still for a long time, then turned toward Margaret. His eyes were darker now, heavier, but not with sadness, with knowing. On the walk back, no one spoke. The woods felt different. Or maybe she did. The air felt less like something she moved through and more like something that moved with her. At the ridge, she paused. She turned and looked back. The hollow lay quiet, but not empty. It was still watching. Dusk looked too. He lingered longer. Margaret reached over and touched his arm. He lowered his head slightly and followed her home. The cabin came into view again like a photograph returning to focus. The roof, the porch, the worn steps. Birch was still sleeping near the stove. The fire had gone low. Dawn ran ahead, bounded up the stairs with her new offering in her mouth, tail wagging like wind in spring grass. Margaret didn't rush. At the top of the hill, she paused again, turned her face back toward the woods, and whispered something so soft it barely passed her lips. "Thank you." The trees did not answer, but something in their silence said they heard. The sun that morning was kind. It didn't blaze or shout. It just lingered, low and wide across the clearing, spreading golden warmth across the porch planks and through the thin curtains of the cabin windows. The moss steamed gently. The trees stood still, as if giving the light a moment to stay a little longer. Inside, Margaret moved slowly, careful with the way her feet touched the floor, like she didn't want to wake something not quite asleep. Birch hadn't stood up since the night before. Her ribs moved, but with effort. Her eyes flickered, dull now. Not from sleep, but from a quiet kind of surrender. Margaret had seen that look before, in people, in animals, in the mirror. It wasn't fear. It wasn't pain. It was the body leaning toward rest in a way it couldn't come back from. Dusk was the first to notice something had changed. He walked in from the porch, ducking slightly under the frame that had once dwarfed him. He paused at the edge of the rug, eyes fixed on Birch, body held still, as if unsure if he was allowed to breathe in this moment. Dawn padded in behind him, tail wagging lightly, until she caught the weight in the room. Her head tilted. She approached slowly, her paw steps quieter than they'd ever been. Birch raised her head, just a little, enough to see them, enough to let out a small sigh that barely lifted above the sound of the kettle on the stove. Margaret sank to her knees beside her, placing one hand on that weathered fur. Fur she'd brushed after every bath. Fur she'd dried in front of the fire on stormy days. Fur that had once bristled with wild fear when Everett first brought her home, trembling and half-starved. That memory caught her off guard now. Everett's voice. She needs us, and one day we'll need her too. That day had come and gone. Now this one was different. Dusk knelt beside her, his hands large and unsure. He didn't touch Birch at first. He just sat there, his fingers curling slightly, then straightening like he was waiting for a sign. Margaret didn't tell him what to do. She just watched. Then Dawn stepped forward, nuzzled Birch's muzzle and lay down at her side. Dusk followed, one on each side, like roots wrapping around a tree. Margaret couldn't hold it in anymore. The tears didn't fall loud, didn't choke her. They just slid, quiet and steady. Later that day, when the light warmed into its fullest yellow, Birch tried to stand. Her front legs moved, her back legs did not. She pushed, tried again and again. Margaret moved to help, but stopped when Dusk stepped forward. He crouched low, arms out slightly, like he'd seen her do once with Dawn when she'd first limped home. He didn't grab Birch. He offered. She let him. He lifted her slowly, gently, not off the ground, just enough so that her weight could shift. Dawn circled around to Birch's other side, and together the two of them walked her out onto the porch. Step by step. The kind of walk people remember when they speak at funerals. Not because it was graceful, but because it was love in motion. Margaret followed, holding her breath. They reached the sun patch on the porch. Birch collapsed there, not in pain, but in peace. Her eyes closed. Her chest rose slower now. Her tail gave a final, lazy thump against the wood. Margaret sat on the step, her back against the rail, the sun pressing against her knees, and she waited. The shadows began to shift around mid-afternoon. Long shapes appeared at the edge of the clearing, between the trees, standing silent, watching, not hidden anymore. Whispering Clan had come, not in full force, not loudly, but enough. Enough for presence to matter. One by one, they stepped into the open. No stomping, no noise, just arrival. Margaret didn't stand. She didn't flinch. She only turned her head slightly as Dusk stood and walked down the porch steps to meet them. The leader, the same elder who had touched her shoulder in Moonridge, met Dusk's gaze. He looked past him, toward the porch, toward Birch. There was no gesture, no nod, but Margaret felt the acknowledgement. Then, the clan began to move in that way they always did. Coordinated, quiet, sacred. They didn't speak, they built. From the edge of the woods, they gathered branches, soft moss, ferns, bark that had fallen cleanly from cedar trees. They arranged them in patterns, not piles. Everything had rhythm. Birch's resting place took shape not like a burial site, but like a cradle. Dusk helped. He moved the way they did now, in rhythm. Dawn stood beside Margaret, tail low, ears back. Margaret placed her hand on Dawn's head. As the sun dipped toward the trees, Birch opened her eyes one last time. She looked at Margaret first, licked her fingers weakly. Then she turned her head, nudged her nose against Dawn's cheek, and last, slowly, with breath hitching, pressed her forehead against Dusk's chest. He held still, didn't pull away. He let her stay there until the last breath left her body. It came like a sigh. It left like a prayer. The forest didn't move. The wind didn't blow. Even the fire inside the cabin held its breath. Margaret rose. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't say, "Thank you." She just walked beside them as Birch's body was lifted gently, Dusk on one side, the elder on the other, and placed into the cradle of forest. Moss was laid over her first, then ferns, then woven branches, tied at the tips with vines. Over it all, Dusk placed a thick block of cedar, the one he had carved himself, with a series of patterns etched into the surface, taps, grooves, rhythms she had learned to hear even when he made no sound. The clan stepped back. Margaret stayed. She knelt, pressed her hand against the wood, and closed her eyes. When she rose, no one clapped, no one chanted. They simply bowed their heads. It was enough. Dusk stood beside her now, his body no longer shaped like a boy, his face shadowed with something ancient, something that had always belonged to them, but now also belonged to her. On the walk home, no one spoke. Back at the cabin, the fire was still going. Dawn lay down in her usual spot near the stove, but left a space beside her. Her nose twitched, as if still waiting for Birch's warm flank to press against her own. Dusk stood outside on the porch. Margaret joined him, arms folded. They didn't look at each other. They looked at the trees, at the sky starting to burn orange, at the space where something sacred had happened, and the world had kept turning anyway. Dusk placed his hand on the railing. Then he began to tap. 3 beats. A pause. 2 beats. Margaret didn't ask what it meant. She didn't need to. The wind finally returned, soft and warm, carrying the scent of sun-baked pine and something else, something that smelled like farewell, but not goodbye. The sun that morning crept over the ridgeline slow and soft, like it too didn't want this story to end. The cabin, quiet but not empty, sat wrapped in that kind of mountain silence that holds the world like a breath. The smoke from the chimney curled upwards, lazy, almost shy. Birds didn't sing much. Maybe they understood something was shifting, something sacred and rare reaching its final beat. Ruth stood by the open doorway, her hand on the frame as if anchoring herself. Her body, though weary from the last few weeks, held a quiet strength, and her eyes, those steadfast old eyes, carried something more than resolve. They carried release. A soft wind lifted the hem of her flannel sleeve. The forest had gone gold again. Early autumn, when the light glows like memory. Inside, Nora finished packing the last of her things into the little knapsack Grandma had sewn from Grandpa's old denim. Her fingers lingered on the fabric longer than she meant. She didn't want to leave. Not fully. Not ever. But she knew now it wasn't about staying. It was about learning when to let go and when to trust what was given to you. She looked over her shoulder toward the journal, still open on the table beside the cold teacup. The pages had shifted slightly overnight, as if something had touched them. A breeze, a whisper, a goodbye. She closed the cover gently. The initials etched into the leather, WJH, looked deeper now, like they'd been waiting all this time to be remembered. The old camera beside it was silent, but the film inside, that held things no one else could ever explain. Maybe some truths weren't meant to be shared with the world. Maybe some truths were sacred enough to protect, not publish. Ruth reached over and adjusted the strap across Nora's shoulder. "You sure you got everything, sweetheart?" Her voice cracked slightly, but not from doubt. Just the weight of love stretching across generations. "I got what matters," Nora replied, eyes glinting like the lake at dusk. They stepped onto the porch together, and Ruth paused, listening. She wasn't listening for noise. No rustle, no branch breaking. She was listening for peace. And for the first time in 40 years, she heard it. Far off beyond the birch grove, the sound of large footsteps moving through brush faded into the trees. Not rushing, not afraid. Just returning, just free. Birch had gone. And somehow, she'd said goodbye without ever speaking a word. They knew she'd come back when it was time. That was the thing about those beings. They didn't leave forever. They returned, not when you wanted them to, but when the forest said it was safe again. When the quiet could hold them. Nora and Ruth walked down the path without speaking. The light danced through the leaves like a memory they hadn't lived yet. At the fork in the trail, they stopped. "I'll walk you to the crest," Ruth said, adjusting the shawl around her shoulders. Nora nodded. She didn't need the escort. She needed the company. As they reached the overlook, the valley below opened like a secret told only once in a lifetime. The sanctuary glowed in the distance. No signs, no gates. Just presence. There were things moving down there. Shadows, shapes, family. Ruth touched Nora's wrist. "I reckon the world doesn't have to understand what happened here. We do. That's enough." Nora swallowed hard, the lump in her throat thick and human. "Do you think it ever gets easier, letting go?" Ruth exhaled slowly. "No, but it gets clearer." They stood together in that stillness for a long while, letting time pass without hurrying it along. When it felt right, Nora started down the trail alone. Her boots kicked up small bursts of pine needles. She didn't look back, not because she didn't want to, but because she didn't need to. Her roots weren't behind her. They were beneath her, carried in her feet, her breath, her bones. Back at the cabin, Ruth stepped inside and lit the lantern, even though there was still light. Old habits. She made tea, the good kind, the kind with honey. Then she sat down and picked up the carved wooden token Birch had left behind. It wasn't big, not ornate, just a smooth circle of cedar, warm in her palm. Etched into it was a single mark, like an eye, or a seed, or a beginning. She held it to her chest and closed her eyes. For the first time in years, she didn't feel watched. She felt seen. Later that evening, just before dusk, something knocked softly on the side window. Not a branch, not a squirrel, a rhythm. 3 soft taps. Ruth opened it slowly. Outside, perched on the edge of the windowsill, was a delicate bundle wrapped in moss and stitched leaves. Inside, the bone comb she thought she'd lost 20 years ago. And beside it, a single gray hair, not hers. No note, no explanation, just remembrance. Some debts weren't owed, they were offered. Across the ridge, Nora reached the bus stop just as the last clouds of afternoon cleared. She looked down at her hand, still holding the small paper Birch had given her. A sketch, rough but unmistakable. Ruth's face smiling, drawn by something that wasn't supposed to understand art. She folded it and tucked it in her jacket pocket, close to her heart. When the bus pulled up, the driver nodded. No words exchanged. He just knew. That kind of knowing didn't need a story. As the bus pulled away from the ridge, the mountains didn't get smaller. They just settled behind her, watching, protecting, and somewhere deep in the trees, the last echo of a summer's promise curled up beneath a canopy of stars, waiting for spring. Because what had been built here, what had been trusted and given and kept, it didn't die. It hibernated. And kindness, once given, never really disappears. It moves, it grows, it returns, even when no one's watching, especially then. This wasn't just the end of a chapter. It was the soft beginning of something the world might never fully understand, but could always feel in the stillness between words. And that was more than enough. Sometimes what heals us isn't loud. It doesn't come crashing in with clarity or applause. Sometimes it's the soft return of silence after years of noise, the feeling of air shifting in a room you thought would stay heavy forever. Sometimes it's not a miracle. It's the way someone chooses to stay, or walk away, or forgive, or simply listen when the world has nothing left to say. Not all stories are meant to be understood by everyone. Some are written in the hush between seasons, in the footprints left behind by something too kind, too wild, too sacred to ever be captured. And yet, those stories change us. They reach a part of the heart that logic can't touch. They remind us that there's something bigger than what we see, older than what we remember, and deeper than what we admit. Maybe there are things out there, creatures, spirits, forces, that will never fit into the pages of a book or the frame of a photograph. But maybe they were never meant to. Maybe they exist just to remind us of something we forgot. That kindness is never wasted. That trust, once given, leaves echoes long after the sound fades. That there's beauty in things we can't prove, and peace in things we no longer need to chase. Boundaries aren't always walls. Sometimes they're bridges, or a whispered understanding between two beings who have no shared language, only shared loss. Sometimes the greatest act of love is stepping back. Sometimes it's staying close without asking for anything in return. In a world that moves too fast and speaks too loud, there's still a place for quiet things, for slow forgiveness, for old promises kept in silence, for creatures who carry memory in their bones and leave gentleness where they walk. And maybe, just maybe, if we're still enough, if we choose to see with more than our eyes, we'll realize that we're never as alone as we think. Because in the end, what matters most isn't who's watching, it's who shows up again and again, even when there's nothing left to say. Thank you truly for taking the time to walk through this journey with us. If this story stirred something in you, if it made you feel, or remember, or hope, please share that with us in the comments. Let us know where you're listening from and what part of this touched you the most. It's your voice that keeps this forest alive. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, where wonder and heart meet in the quiet corners of the world, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel. Together, we're building a community of people who still believe in gentleness, in mystery, and in the power of stories that leave you thinking long after the last word. Wherever you are tonight, may you feel seen, may you feel safe, and may you always know, kindness echoes farther than you think.